Welcome to another episode of Exercise Matters with me, Randall Cooper.
And me, Mick Hughes.
Support for today's episode comes from Premax Performance Skincare. If you're active, you focus on strength, endurance and recovery. But what about your skin? Sweat, friction and the elements take a toll. That's where Premax comes in. High-performance skincare made for high-performance people. From recovery creams to anti-chafe balms, massage creams to exercise-specific barrier creams, we help your skin go the distance. Keep your skin as fit as your body with Premax. Available now at premax.co.
And support for today's episode also comes from Learn.physio. Health professionals, are you staying ahead of the game? Learn.physio brings you cutting-edge education from world-class experts in sports and musculoskeletal medicine. Online courses, hands-on practicals and expert resources, all backed by the latest evidence and designed to fit into your busy schedule. To be your best, learn from the best. Get started today at Learn.physio.
Well, g'day Mick, how are you?
G'day mate, I'm well, how are you? Good weekend?
Yeah, not too bad. The last couple of podcasts we've recorded, I've come off weekends that have been quite taxing and I've been sore, but I must admit I'm feeling a lot more comfortable sitting in the chair today. What about you?
You listen to your body, mate.
I'm listening.
Yeah, I did. I listened to my body. Last week I was feeling a bit grumpy, bit tired, bit grumpy. Didn't really know why. I kind of put my finger on it that I'd been going pretty hard in the gym and exercise-wise for about a month, and I felt like maybe that was it. So it was a bit cold, a bit wet, so I had a few excuses to actually have a sleep in or two through the back end of the week and over the weekend. Woke up today feeling bright as a button. So I felt like that was kind of my body telling me something just to slow down a bit, which was good. It's good to sort of be able to mature in my older years and listen to those little things that are telling me to slow down.
It is. It's an important thing. I think that maybe we should discuss it in one episode. That essentially like your own body awareness is, I think, such a skill and an asset in exercise and sport. If you can know when to push, and I'm going to do an episode on this in a few actually about pain, about how hard to push and what's good pain versus what's bad pain, when to know when you're getting injured or your system's flat and you need to take a rest. Those little nuances in your own program can make a huge difference on whether you break down or whether you succeed.
Yeah, I've certainly started to take a leaf. I've been a terrible physio, I must admit, over the years. I've been, just do as I say, not as I do, kind of thing.
We're all like that, Mick.
My own personal training and my own rehab practices were just far from being evidence-based applied to myself. It was just, I'll just rest it and be right. But, in the last couple of years, I've actually listened and started to practice a bit more what I preach. And I certainly preach to my patients, every 4 to 6 weeks, just have a deload week, just take the foot off the gas for a bit, even if it's just reduce your load by 50%. That for some people is just cut your training sessions in half. So instead of doing 4, do 2. Or if you just want to have a Netflix week and chill, put your feet up and have a guilt-free week where you don't do anything, but let's crack back on the week after. So I've started to listen to those kind of things and I'm seeing the benefits of it. So yeah.
Good for you,
I'm
mate.
better. I'm better.
That's great. Good. I'm glad you're listening to yourself.
It's taken me only 45 years. We've got a slower paced podcast today. Last couple of weeks ago, we kind of ramped things up with a HIIT style podcast, which you tackled quite nicely. Well, this one's just a little bit slower and steadier, and it's on 10,000 steps, and the whole premise of 10,000 steps. And I actually must admit, long story short, my dog's a bit overweight.
Mm-hmm.
And I took her to the vet the other day and she put on 4 kilos and I just reflected, it was like in the last 6 months, I haven't been walking her enough. I've been giving her too many treats and lately I've just been spending a lot more time in the gym and walking her less. And so I was like, all right, well, that's my kind of wake up call to actually get out there and start walking her more. So those HIIT sessions we talked about a couple of weeks ago, those bad, uncomfortable sessions on the assault bike, I've actually put them away for a couple of weeks. I've actually started embracing the long, slow, steady walks again.
You have?
Yeah. Due to my poor exercise habits, to my poor little Luna over there, sitting there looking at me right now, real sad eyes. She's about 3 or 4 kilos overweight. So now I'm just taking her for a few more walks and substituting those HIIT sessions for some 10,000 steps a day instead. It's a nice little segue to the topic we're talking about today.
It is, but you've got a mountain or a large hill out the back of your place in Townsville, don't you?
Yeah.
Is that generally where you're walking and walking your dog?
Yeah, it is. It's convenient. It takes an hour and 15 minutes to get up to the top and back. It's a 5 kilometer loop. By the time I get home, I've clocked out about 7,500 steps in that journey, with the first half of it obviously being on the more higher intense range of heart rate, with the way down obviously being a little bit easier and a little bit more comfortable, and sort of sits down into that, certainly that moderate, 60 to 70% intensity zone, as opposed to on the way up, I'm hitting, 80 to 90% heart rate zone. But there are a lot of flat tracks, but that's just the most convenient one for me and the pup. So that's what I tackle about 3 or 4 mornings a week now. Do that for a big chunk of the time after moving back here, but the gym has certainly been a bit more of a favourite in the last few months.
So if you're doing 7,500 steps with your walk, most people will kind of do about 2,500 to 3,500 steps just day to day. So you're probably just reaching 10,000. So my question to you, mate, and this is a beautiful kind of segue into you launching off, is 10,000 steps the right number?
Yeah, that's what we'll tackle today. And just to, I guess, spoiler alert, it's a nice target, but it's not the be all and end all, which is, I guess, quite satisfying to probably hear for some people who probably struggle to get to that 10,000 mark. There's not enough minutes in every day for some people. It's actually it was an actually really interesting deep dive, this podcast episode, because do you know the history to some of this physical activity research that was kind of born about 50, 70 or 70 years ago now? Do you know where it kind of first started, where researchers were starting to look at this kind of thing?
No, I don't. So enlighten me.
So there was a seminal paper in early 1950s, by, I want to get the name right, Morris and colleagues. They were a group of London-based researchers, and they must have been observing behaviours and physical activity behaviours of the working class and the people within London for a while. And they kind of noticed this trend that double-decker bus drivers compared to the double-decker conductors had very, very different body types, to the point where the bus drivers were much more overweight and obese. The conductors, who walked around the buses up and down the steps and collected tickets and punched the tickets and made sure everyone had paid their fare, were much more leaner. And they did this study, and they found cardiovascular risk factors and a few other kind of lifestyle-related risk factors were much less in the conductors versus the bus drivers. So that's kind of like how it was all first started back in the 1950s, and it's kind of born from that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I've got a philosophical question for you before we kind of get in. Is how do you frame up walking? Do you, and particularly like aiming for a target, whether it's 8,000, 10,000, 15,000 steps a day, do you consider it exercise, or do you consider it just an activity of daily living?
Me personally, it's hard, because I now know from the deep dive that the intensity probably doesn't matter so much, and we'll talk a bit more about this. But in the past, I would have thought, and to myself would have said, well, if I'm going for a walk, it's 45 minutes continuously. It's at a brisk pace. I kind of want to feel like I've gone for, I've got my heart rate up. I want to feel a bit uncomfortable at times. I want to feel a bit hot and sweaty, as opposed to just accumulating steps for the sake of being, steps. That's kind of like how and that's how I would have framed it up to my patients as well. Saying, if we want to get physical activity, we want to meet some guidelines, we need to get your heart rate up for at least, 70% of your maximum heart rate. And we want to achieve that in 30 minutes a day, and try and stick to those moderate activity guidelines that are recommended by the World Health Organization. But it seems to me from this sort of research that it probably doesn't matter so much the intensity, but moreover, it's more about to do the accumulation and the volume of steps per day for some people. And I think this is where it's lovely, because some people will just not have the time, through life and, circumstance or whatever it may be. They may not have the time to dedicate 30 to 45 minutes continuously to do that moderate paced exercise. And I think that's the thing we want to really promote, is how you get exercise and how you become active kind of doesn't matter for the vast majority of us. Obviously, elite athletes and sports people need to probably train in a particular way that's going to give them the best bang for buck for those chosen activities to get better and perform. But probably 90% of us who kind of just want to live our best life and have quality of life that allows us to play with our kids and, not feel so old and decrepit when we wake up every morning. Like it kind of doesn't really matter, and just find something enjoyable is kind of probably what I'm starting to steer towards these days. What about you?
It's a really interesting question as to what is exercise and what is activity. And clearly, I don't think that there's a solid line between the two, and it is a continuum. And I think it's depends on the person as well, because if you're an elite triathlete who does Ironman, getting 10,000 steps a day is just part and parcel of what you do. You don't need to go out and do any more. Whereas if you're thinking that, you are like your dog Luna, a little bit overweight, and you just want to start getting going, then 10,000 steps and going for an hour walk every day is definitely exercise. So, yeah, I think that whatever the case, it's just good to do. And I'm interested in some of the studies you're going to talk us through today.
Yeah. So we want to tackle I'm going to tackle three kind of main topics today, and things to discuss. Is the first one, is 10,000 steps the goal? And is that the goal, and should it be the goal for the vast majority of us? Does step rate matter, or does intensity or walking speed matter? And then lastly, what impact does our sedentary time have on our step count? So, can we lead these really sedentary lives and make up for it at the start of the day or the end of the day with lots of steps and physical activity, or kind of does the sedentary activity kind of rub out all the hard work that you do? And we'll try and tackle those. I think probably ticking off to start with, we probably should set the scene with what is sedentary time. And we're certainly living in a world now where we are much more sedentary than ever before in past generations. Like, you just have to look around, like we've got robot vacuum cleaners, no longer are we vacuuming much anymore. We've got robot lawn mowers, and electric powered lawn mowers, all these things, and ride on lawn mowers, all these things that we used to do, physically. Electric bikes. Like, I laughed the other day at the kids. It was like this electric bike was zooming past us, and this bloke was not moving his legs one little bit, but he was flying at 40 kilometers an hour. I'm like, but he gets to work and tells his mates he rides to work 20 minutes every day. It's like, he hasn't done a lick of exercise. But yeah, everything's becoming more sedentary. We're becoming less active. And so sedentary behavior, by its definition, is any waking behavior characterized by an energy expenditure of less than 1.5 metabolic equivalents, or METs, for us exercise science nerds. And that's often a metric or an objective number that'll be used in research circles. So less than 1.5 METs. Usually it's in our waking days, it's sitting, reclining, or lying. So watching TV, watching screens, any time of screen behavior, basically. Driving and reading basically encompass sedentary activity. Ultimately, what we've sort of found and this isn't part of my review, but one meta-analysis that I briefed over was that sedentary activity certainly has strong links to various amounts of cancers, being ovarian, endometrial, colon, breast, rectal, all associated with at least a 20% increased risk activity, not to mention type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular diseases. Sedentary behavior is certainly a big problem, and we're becoming a much more sedentary population than ever before.
Yeah, no, I've noticed it as well. And even for me personally, in recent years, I'm not doing as much hands-on physio as what I did 10 years ago. And I know that when I was, essentially a full-time physio, I was up and down, showing exercises all day, walking people in and out of the waiting room. To get those steps in and to get that activity going was easy for me. Now, because I sit most of the time talking to you on a computer,
yeah,
it's much harder. You have to be really conscious of it. So for me, I've actually got a rule with myself that if I can do it physically and not without a machine, then I usually try and do it that way. And that particularly is outside. Like, we've got a long driveway, which is kind of a 10% gradient on my property. So it's about 150, 200 meters. So I take the heavy bins up there rather than putting it on back of the car every time, just to make sure that I get those steps in and get the work in. But it's hard to integrate because things are so easy. You're right.
Yep. Yeah. And what you said before, I'd get 7,500 steps in for my walk. My day-to-day walking around at work when I'm in the clinic 3 days a week, I'd easily total between 5 to 7,500, depending on how busy the day was and kind of how active my patients were. So certainly easy as physios and health professionals. If we sort of think about, a lot of people who listen to this podcast, exercise scientists and PTs and physios, we're probably all fairly active people, not to mention all the stuff that we love to do, but a lot of our patients that we see walk in the door, probably not so much, not all of them anyway.
Interesting.
Well, the first paper we're going to tackle today is a big one that kind of sets the scene with this 10,000 steps the goal. It was a huge meta-analysis and systematic review conducted by a large group of authors and was published in the Lancet publication, which is a really highly regarded, well-respected journal, back in 2022, led by the author of Paluch, and another probably 50 names there written underneath his name. So a big, strong study with a lot of researchers.
It was big, yep.
15 trials were included in this study from countries all across the world, which showed the really strong diversification of the people included in this trial from the UK, USA, Japan, Norway, Australia, Germany, Sweden, and even one study included that had data from 40 different countries. So really diverse geographical representation here. In total, they had nearly 50,000 participants included in the trial, which is a really strong number of people to get data from. Average age was 65 years old. So on the older side of the spectrum, we've been largely talking about young, fit, healthies. So we're certainly looking at an older population here. And for once in our discussion, we're actually seeing a population strongly covered with females. So 70% of the population in this study were females, which is much, much stronger than any other study we've sort of talked about to date. And 70% were of white and Caucasian race. So these authors looked at all-cause mortality, so any cause of death. And the follow-up was roughly about 7 years, with one study had a 13-year follow-up. So really, really strong numbers. So the overarching message here was that more steps had a lower mortality rate and risk, but it certainly plateaued over a certain number. So essentially taking more steps per day progressively lowered the risk of death. However, there wasn't a benefit. So beyond 10,000, there wasn't a benefit. So if you took 12,000 steps per day, 15,000, nearly 20,000, there wasn't any perceived benefit or actual benefit beyond that number. So the big golden ticket question was, do steps matter, and is 10,000 the number? The answer is no, but here comes a little caveat, is for older adults, so older people aged over 60, the mortality risk plateaued between 6,000 and 8,000 steps a day.
Okay.
So nothing beyond that for people that were older. For younger people, so aged under 60, the plateau of mortality risk plateaued between 8,000 and 10,000 steps a day. So for younger people, there's definitely a benefit to get closer to 10,000, and certainly between 8 and 10 seems to be a sweet spot. For older people, between 6 and 8,000 steps seems to be the optimal number of steps per day. Between males and females, there was no significant difference between them in should males walk more or should females walk more, should they take more steps. There was no benefit there. So in conclusion, really strong meta-analysis provides strong evidence that increasing daily steps is certainly a powerful way to reduce the risk of all-cause mortality. And it certainly challenges this notion that 10,000 steps should be the thing we'd be aiming for, because in our older population, as little as 6,000 can be beneficial, and in our younger population, so those aged less than 60, even as little as 8,000. But of course, there's certainly no harm in getting closer to 10,000, but also too, aiming for 12, aiming for 14, 15, 16,000 steps a day. It doesn't lower your risk of any mortality. We're all going to die, obviously, but it's how long can we push that out? And certainly taking more steps per day doesn't add that much more value beyond 10,000 steps from what we saw in these strong study.
In this paper, or even just with your research generally, Mick, did you find that, do they make any comments about the difference between, like we were talking about before, the incidental walking where you're just integrating it day to day versus going for a specific kind of, you put your runners on, you go for a walk for an hour, for instance? Does that flesh out? Because, we always talk about the difference between causation and correlation. And I'm just wondering, is it those people who have just got generally active lives who do maybe what I do a little bit and just try and walk as much and try and integrate physical activity into their day-to-day life as much, leading generally healthier, better lives, versus the people who maybe, let's say, less healthy, not eating well, sedentary more, but say, I'm still going to go and get a cram in my 10,000 steps because that's the magic number at the moment.
Yeah, it doesn't really flesh out in what I read and what I saw. It did purely just look at that metric of 10,000. I'm sure the researchers looked at lots of different little things, but the goal of these papers in particular is 10,000 steps a big point of difference? Because I think a lot of these public health papers, they're really trying to make life as easy as possible for busy people. I guess from a really, public health message, it's like, okay, what kind of message can we get out there to reduce the burden on, the health systems? If we, the nutritional guidelines obviously are a big help, the 5 and 2, the World Health Organizations of, getting 150 minutes of moderate intensity exercise, all those kind of things. For some people, moderate intensity exercise probably doesn't mean much to them through health literacy or whatever it be, but 10,000 steps with the rise of data and technology and smartwatches and smartphones, and pedometers used to be a thing that were pretty tricky to get, and it was kind of like a luxury item, whereas now most people have got a good step counter on their phone or their smartwatch. And so I think from a global health perspective, they're probably a bit more interested in these really simplified messages to make life as easy as possible. So I didn't get anything out of these papers that I looked at other than, and we'll talk about it now, is intensity. So step intensity, does that kind of matter? Because I get your point. You could lead a rubbish lifestyle. You could sit for 12 hours a day. You could eat 5,000 calories a day when all you need is 2,000 for most average male. Females probably a little bit less than that. But if you're sedentary, eating rubbish, the message of can you outrun a bad diet, get that, because you can have this rubbish lifestyle but still take your 10,000 steps. Will that kind of still give you a good quality of life? I don't know. I don't know from what I've found.
Yeah, okay. All right, well, let's move into intensity, because I think that's important as well, particularly if you think about someone who runs 5Ks every day, and whether that adds to the benefit or not.
Yeah, well, it sort of surprised me quite a lot, because it looks like intensity probably doesn't matter so much. And I guess also the context of, each paper and the person sitting in front of us when we, talk about this kind of stuff, we need to take everything in. But what this paper found was, and this was a survey, this was a smaller survey, and it was a representative look at US adults, and it was data analysed from the National Health and Nutrition Exam Survey. And it included analysis of nearly 5,000 people aged 40 years or older, and they all had accelerometry data. So 54% were women. The follow-up period was 10 years post-trial, looking at the relationship between total daily step count and mortality, all-cause mortality, cardiovascular disease and cancer, and the association between step intensity or cadence and mortality too was looked at. So it had a really nice, diverse group of males and females. It had a good follow-up period of time, and they actually found, quite interestingly, that intensity didn't matter that greatly, to the point where it wasn't significant. So
in reference to mortality, is that right? So
all-cause mortality.
Yep.
So I'll read these out. So the first one was more steps equal to lower mortality risk, and there was a clear dose-response relationship here. So compared to individuals who took 4,000 steps per day, which was the baseline number, taking 8,000 steps per day was associated with a 50% lower risk of all-cause mortality. So certainly taking more in this instance was better. Taking 12,000 steps a day in this group was associated with a 65% lower risk of all-cause mortality. The other paper we talked about before, a much bigger, robust trial, said that beyond 10,000 didn't make a difference. But in this study of US participants, 12,000 steps definitely did show a benefit. Now, when it comes to intensity, it was more about quantity over intensity. So one of the most significant findings in this paper was that step intensity or cadence was not significantly associated with lower mortality after adjusting for the total number of steps per day, meaning that walking faster might feel more intense. The primary benefit for reducing mortality risk, and it didn't eventuate. And it was commented here that the total volume of steps you accumulate throughout the day rather than the speed that you take them matters the most. So this was quite interesting, and the benefits were across the board, young and old, and different races of Americans. So really, really fascinating findings, and it certainly kind of goes against what I would have assumed that intensity would have certainly helped. If we look at high intensity interval training, we've talked about that before. We've talked about the benefits of zone 2, well, not deeply yet, but we know moderate intensity exercise, so 70% is widely regarded as a really great sort of intensity to be exercising at. When we step and we just take steps for the sake of taking steps, and if we're just accumulating 1,000 here, 1,000 there, more often than not, we're probably not pushing into those intensities unless we're going upstairs or up hills, or we've got a conscious effort to walk at a brisk pace. So this was purely looking at the volume of steps per day, and it seemed to be the volume mattered more than the intensity.
Yeah, I'm with you. To me, that's counterintuitive, because I would thought that if, let's say, we'll just use a 60-year-old person as an example, that if they went for an hour and a half brisk solid walk and accumulated their 10,000 steps there with their heart rate up, higher impact, going through their bones, all those things, you'd think there'd be a health benefit there, versus someone who's just mooching around a flower show or something for the whole day, and having a few cups of tea along the way and not really getting their heart rate up at all.
Yep.
I find that I'm respecting the data, but at the same time, I'm surprised by it.
Yep.
And I have to just kind of put up the white flag, I suppose, and say, well, that's what the study says. And it's a pretty solid study.
It is, and it was published in Journal of American Medical Association. Once again, a really highly regarded paper. So yes, this was more of it was a survey. It certainly wasn't a meta-analysis, systematic review. It certainly was on the stronger side of, it was certainly level 2, level 3 evidence. So not as robust as some of the things we do discuss, but it was a really strong, had a strong number, had nearly 5,000 participants, and it had a really good representation of people. I think it's interesting, because we've got a bias obviously towards exercise, and I reflect on, some of these longevity kind of series, the Blue Zone on Netflix, and people who are trying to extend their life, and they've taken a deep dive into what kind of allows people to have these great, wonderful, high quality lives with lots of love and fulfillment and all that kind of stuff. And exercise probably doesn't weigh into it as much as what we probably bias and perceive it to be. Like, there's certainly bigger things in people's lives that actually adds value and adds life into their years. But we've obviously got our strong bias that exercise is definitely the thing that people need to do, and obviously it helps to some degree, but probably not as much as what we may think sometimes. But that one was an interesting one. So certainly volume matters more than intensity.
Okay, mate, accepted. And let's move on.
We'll see if time changes with that over time. Number 3, rounding things out for the big deep dive, was that, does your sedentary activity affect how many steps you take? So ultimately, can you laze around all day, and can you have this rubbish lifestyle, and then can you make up for it with a front end of the day or a back end of the day, big blast of 10,000 steps or more? So this was a deep dive into the UK Biobank. Not exactly sure what it is, but it's well, it sounds a lot probably more scientific than what it is, but it's basically it's a big data collection of UK participants, and it's a prospective cohort study. This one was. People had to meet inclusion and exclusion criteria, so to be able to be included in this bank of data. So once again, a really strong, robust study. This was looking at all-cause mortality in 72,000 participants. Actually looking at cardiovascular diseases though, and that was probably the primary outcome that we're looking for here. So on average, once again, probably got an older group of people we're looking at here, so 61 years of older, mostly female, so nearly 60% were female, and followed up for an average of 7 years. And what the participants did, basically the data they wore, or the data collected was based on a 24 hours a day physical activity and sedentary activity for a 7-day period. And this was the interesting thing. So a lot of these data points that are grabbed, they're basically based on that person's activity in a 7-day window, and then they're kind of tracked. So assuming that this person carries on this physical activity week after week, month after month, I assume that's kind of like how this is all taken into account, because it's quite fascinating. You'd think some of these studies, you'd probably want to get a better look at their trend and physical activity behavior beyond a week, because I know a week between my physical activity and the next can vary so greatly. We talked about this at the start of the show. Like last week I took it really easy, but I'd been flogging myself for the weeks before that. Anyway, I digress. So the study basically cut the group in half into high sedentary time, which was it was defined as more than 10.5 hours of sedentary activity every day, to low. And so we had two different groups here. Low sedentary was less than 10.5, high sedentary over 10.5. Interestingly, over 50%, so 54% of the total sample fell into a high sedentary time, which doesn't surprise me. I think if we all sort of take stock of how many hours per day we sit, we're probably pushing close to most of us around the 10-hour time, especially if we work in an office.
Easy. Yeah.
Yeah. So key findings of this study: steps matter regardless of sitting. So the most significant finding was that sedentary time did not modify the relationship between steps taken each day and all-cause mortality, meaning that the health benefits of accumulating daily steps were largely independent of how much time you spend sitting. So ultimately, your steps still count even if you sit for a long period of time. For all-cause mortality, the sweet spot sat around 9,000 to 10,500 steps a day. So once again, that 10,000 figure is probably coming through as a target, but they did find a minimal step benefit, and the minimum threshold for benefit to reduce your risk of cardiovascular diseases was 4,000 steps per day. But they did say that while your physical activity did wash away a certain degree of cardiovascular risk if you walked, if you had a sedentary time, high sedentary time still was a significant factor for cardiovascular diseases. So while steps benefited across the board, the study did not find there was lower incidence, meaning that steps are beneficial, but we still want to minimize our sedentary time as much as possible. So yeah, interesting findings here. So ultimately aim for 9.5 to 10,500 steps per day. That seems to be the sweet spot. And ultimately every step counts, especially if we have sedentary lifestyles. But we also saw a minimum 4,000 to be effective, but it's not a lot.
And that's an interesting paper as well. And I mean, clearly there's some awesome research done in this area. Most of it is anchored towards longevity and living a long life. I think a lot of people who listen to this podcast are very active and into exercise. And I think that I suppose they just need to kind of take on board that possibly and probably the exercise they're doing, if they're running 5 times a week or, riding 6 hours on a bike on the weekend or whatever, then
Yes,
step count is probably not as important as if you're not doing much. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I agree. There's if you're easily ticking over your whatever the goal is ultimately. Like I always go back to the World Health Organizations and some recommendations of 2 resistance training sessions a week, 150 minutes or more of moderate intensity exercise, or 75 minutes of vigorous exercise per week. Minimize your sedentary time. These kind of things. If people are ticking that off, then I'm happy and sweet. Obviously, people who are super active doing triathlons, running 10, 15K events or training for marathons, playing regular netball, basketball, sport, they're easily ticking off these kind of recommendations. As with my physio hat on, I meet a lot of people who, have got, people with low back pain, neck pain, hip, shoulder pain, all these kind of irks and twerks. And they certainly are really largely sedentary. And they often just need some kind of guidance, where to start. And a lot of people don't know where to start. They can sometimes see these recommendations and see them as insurmountable. And I think that's, these kind of messages here where 10,000 steps is a nice target, but we did see some benefit for as little as 4,000 for a lot of, all-cause mortality risk. So it gives us something to play with some people who are just struggling to buy in. But ultimately, those that are super active, they don't need to take these extra 10,000 steps a day or even as 4,000 steps, if you're already hitting a lot of other big boxes.
Great stuff, mate. That's good to know, and I think you've summed that up beautifully. So I think we're running out of time. So, got anything else to add, or do you want to read us out?
No, nothing else. It was all sort of covered there nicely, mate. So I think that was good. But great chat, mate. Thanks for listening along and nodding your head in the right spots and doing all that. So that's a wrap for this episode of Exercise Matters. If you enjoyed the chat, make sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with your mates. A quick disclaimer, as always: this podcast is for educational purposes only, and it is not medical or individual advice. Always seek guidance from a qualified health professional for your specific needs. A big thanks to our sponsors Premax, high performance skincare for high performance people, and Learn.Physio, world-class education for health professionals. Catch you next week.